SpaceWatchers. Welcome to the second series of our special collaboration with the Prague Security Studies Institute, PSSI. 2 years ago, at the 6th Prague Space Security Conference, we launched a joint project with them to create a special podcast mini-series focused on allied preparedness to face the rapidly evolving space security landscape. It's an absolute pleasure for us to partner with PSSI, a non-profit, non-governmental public policy organization founded in early 2002 and based in Prague. The Institute, among its activities, seeks to illuminate unconventional threats emanating from authoritarian governments that challenge the transatlantic alliance and other partners globally, especially in the economic and financial and space domains. All the interviews in this space security mini-series were conducted during the 7th Prague Space Security Conference, held from the 16th to the 18th of June 2024. The traditionally biannual event will now be held every year. It has become a well-known and established high-level conference series with senior officials from Europe, the US, and Japan. And for the first time, there were also representatives from South Korea and Taiwan, as well as select experts from industry and academia. This series, launched in 2011, is designed to advance allied policy decision-making on critical space security issues. This unclassified gathering brings together the highest levels of military allies, national security experts, and senior industry representatives. Enjoy your listening. Hello, Space Watchers, and welcome back to another episode of Space Café Radio. I have the pleasure and honor to be here with Dean Cheng, consultant on Asian affairs and senior advisor to the U.S. Institute of Peace. Welcome, Dean. How are you doing?
Thank you very much for having me.
It's a pleasure. You are an expert on China, space dynamics, and in general on the Asian-Pacific equilibriums. I want to start from maybe the most banal question of all, China-Russian relationship. How is developed in the past 2 years? We know that 2 years ago, the war in Ukraine disrupted completely the relationship between Russia and the Western, but also somehow strengthened the relationship with China. Can you help us to understand how it evolved?
So Russia and China have shared antipathies. They both dislike the West. They are troubled by the Western international order, but they have limited mutual sympathies. That is, in terms of actual interests, besides the fact that they both dislike the West, they are often operating for their own individual benefit, which sometimes overlap and sometimes do not. What we have seen, for example, in the specific relationship developments over the last 2 years is that China has, above all, provided Russia with an economic lifeline. It has purchased Russian oil and Russian food and provided Russia with money, which is one of the reasons why Western sanctions have had only limited effect. But it's interesting to note that North Korea has provided more actual ammunition, by one recent report, 1 million artillery shells, for example, than China has. China has focused on dual-use technologies, such as microchips, but not actual munitions, guns, bombs, rockets, fighter aircraft, etc.
So in this relationship, that, as you say, I really like the expression of the shared antipathies, is there a clear leader? Is this an equal relationship or not?
Certainly when we look at various metrics, it is hard to argue that this is an equal relationship. China is the second largest economy in the world. Russia's economy would probably qualify for the G20 on a good day, and on a bad day, maybe not. China is the largest trading partner, or the second largest trading partner of almost every country on the planet, including most EU members, including the United States. Russia has been described by a friend of mine as a gas station run by the mafia with nuclear weapons in the basement, which is to say it is not a particularly good economic partner. Russia's ability to corral international support is extraordinarily limited. China, thanks to the Belt and Road Initiative, thanks to its economic prowess, thanks to advanced technology companies like Huawei, can get a lot of countries to support it. And maybe that last part is perhaps the most salient. China is a technological powerhouse. whether it's in terms of 5G, whether it's in terms of new space launch rockets, whether it's in terms of the number of satellites it deploys every year, is far, far ahead of where Russia is.
So, based on all this, why China has some interest? If it's not a good economic partner, where does the interest of China lies in allying with Russia, besides maybe what you just mentioned, the fact that they have a common enemy?
Never underestimate the power of a common enemy. But in addition to that, China does seem to see Russia as a shield against the West. That a Russia that is a failed state, a Russia that collapses, would leave China pretty much alone in facing Western pressure. And China is constantly reminding the world that it is the subject of technology embargoes, of tariffs, of the like. Another piece to this is it is important to remember that Russia does have nuclear weapons. So having a strong nuclear ally, again, is a counterbalance to the West, which has not only the United States, but Great Britain, France, in terms of nuclear capabilities.
So Russia is not a good economic partner, but still holds some strength, especially when it comes to war. As I say, he holds nuclear weapons. So when it comes to Europe, how do you think that Europe should address this China-Russia alliance? Because when it comes to space, somehow Europe got damaged by the broken relationship with Russia. We used to launch, we used to be space partners. How can we as Europeans deal with this?
I think sometimes misfortune can open doors. I think that the realities of Russia meant that at the end of the day, eventually, there were going to be problems between the democratic European community and Russia. And the Ukraine conflict, especially if we date it back to 2014, simply highlighted and brought into high relief the reality that Russia was not going to be a good partner and that there were real prices that were being paid in terms of European security, European ability to access. By the way, this is not limited to Europe. The United States had the same experience because we were buying Russian rocket engines and had the same issue of, with the 2014 deterioration and subsequent, we finally realized we could not afford to remain dependent on Russian rocket motors. With regards to China, this is a separate but related aspect, which is to say that we see in Europe the Chinese tempting European leaders, European capitals, to subsume their national security to economic interests, whether it is access to the Chinese market or importing Chinese goods. China would love to have greater access to European markets, to European technology. And I think that the good news here is this Russia-China relationship, it's too strong to call it an alliance, but an alignment, reminds Europe that this, again, is not a friendly partner, that China poses an economic and technological and cyber threat that Europe needs to, one, be aware of, and two, take measures against. And given the relationship between Russia and China, given the bad actor nature of Russia, I think this has been a useful wake-up call.
Dean, this is very interesting, like the commercial interest, how China can penetrate any sector in the commercial market because of what they have to offer. It's extremely interesting. It was recently news of, I think, from the G7 that the US and Europe both decided to raise the taxes for Chinese imported electric cars to try to protect the market. So this is just right up this problem. So when it comes to commercial interest, how do you think the US will balance its, I don't want to call it need, but let's say that its interest in keep being a partner commercially with China, because as you say, China is a huge commercial market for any partner for any type of country, with the desire of the US to keep maintaining a leading role when it comes to space. They need to collaborate, but they desire to maintain their supremacy. How do you think the US will balance this act?
I think what we are seeing, depending on the sector, and it's very important to distinguish that agriculture is different from airplanes, is different from computer chips. What we are seeing across multiple sectors is a gradual decoupling of parts of the American and Chinese economies. Interestingly, less so in agriculture. China is still a net importer of food. The United States is one of the world's largest food exporters. If you grow soybeans or corn or wheat, China remains a good market. But what we are seeing on both sides of the Pacific, the Chinese are taking steps and the Americans are taking steps to reduce each side's reliance on the other. And here again, it's not just the United States. We have seen, for example, after the Chinese tried to take over one too many German companies, I think Kuko was one of the companies that the German government said, no, you cannot take this over. We are seeing in individual European countries, and of course it varies by country, growing skepticism about, do we want the Chinese to be able to simply buy up these companies or establish serious relationships in ports? And of course, when it comes to certain technologies, and space is absolutely one of the highlights of this, both the United States and Europe long ago concluded allowing China into our respective space launch markets, satellite markets, etc., is simply too risky. And there, what we are going to wind up seeing, I think, is truly a cutthroat competition between Western P-LEO, proliferated low Earth orbit constellations, and Chinese-backed P-LEO constellations. And that is, I think, going to be one of the interesting space races of the next 10 years.
Speaking about space race, I would like to ask you something about the Artemis Accord versus, of course, the Chinese counterpart, which I know they're not the same. This is something that we've been able to discuss before, but the LRS versus the Artemis Accords. My impression, and please do correct me if I'm being naive in this, is that albeit there is no explicit rule that if you sign the Artemis Accord, you cannot sign the LRS and vice versa. We are seeing a kind of geopolitical split. We are seeing certain countries signing the Artemis and some other countries signing the LRS. To my knowledge, at the moment, I've not met a single country that signed both. What do you think that this implies for the geopolitics on Earth, which I think is quite clear, but maybe you can help me, but also projected the geopolitics of the moon?
The geopolitics of space, even the very phrasing, will be a function, a dependent variable of the geopolitics of Earth. Space has always been a following indicator, not a leading indicator. The US-Soviet Apollo-Soyuz mission occurred in the middle of détente. It did not cause détente, it was caused by détente. Similarly, Russia could not have joined the International Space Station until the Soviet Union had collapsed. But in terms of the interesting block natures of the two, when we look at Artemis, one of the notable things is some of the countries that have joined, which includes Brazil and India, which are also members of the BRICS coalition. BRICS, of course, stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And what we already see is that space is producing very different groupings than some of the terrestrial aspects. But before we assume that these are mutually exclusive, let's do keep in mind that it is still in the early days. And I would in particular look to the Middle East as countries that may well decide to join both. Notably, there is, I believe, a UAE university, not the country, that has signed on to ILRS, the International Lunar Research Station, which is the Sino-Russian effort, while the UAE nation, I believe, has in fact joined Artemis. And we may see a number of such mixed relations where individual universities, individual companies may join one side and the nation join the other simply in order to cover their bets and also to see what kinds of technology and opportunities may be leveraged. To a certain extent, I fully expect some countries to almost be open to the highest bidding. What will you offer me to join your coalition? What opportunities will you present for if I join your coalition? There's nothing wrong with that. This is in the best interest of the individual countries. We saw this, frankly, during the Cold War when some countries did, in fact, open themselves up to the highest bidder between the West and the Soviet Union. I think that we are likely to see that again going forward with regards to not only the moon, but research opportunities on asteroids and meteors, as well as eventually going to Mars.
How do you think the US will deal with the UAE is a perfect example of the nation that signed up for the Artemis Accord, but an institution within the UAE that signed for the LRS. Do you think that the US will put in place some limitations or some conditions to avoid sharing of technology or space is a sensitive ground?
Keeping in mind that the Artemis Accords are more normative behavior patterns. It's not a technology sharing per se, although there is an opportunity for that as the lunar mission portion gets more real. There is the open question about technology. But I think that for both China and the United States, Russia to a lesser extent, the nation that first starts saying anyone who joins the other side is unacceptable to me is a side that is going to lose the propaganda, is going to be very quickly portrayed as the exclusionary state. I think if I were to make a recommendation to American authorities, I would say this is a classic example of where honey is much better than vinegar. Offering better benefits to be aligned solely with the United States, highlighting potential information security issues by partnering with China is a much wiser approach, in my opinion, than for the U.S. to start dictating, if you have joined the Chinese side, you are not welcome anymore on this side.
Last question, Dean. At the moment, the dialogue seems to be interrupted, seems to be frozen, the temperature seems rising, the tension between the two countries, between the US and China seems rising. Do you think we still are in a point when we can try to approach this in a diplomatic and collaborative way? And if so, how? Or do you think we just passed the point and we are going to look into a possible scenario of open conflict?
First off, I think that there is an enormous amount of room between open conflict and lack of collaboration. I, for one, do not think that we are on the eve of war, whether in space or even terrestrially. There are a lot of tensions. But I am very, 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 very pessimistic about any potential of collaboration in space between the United States and China. There are fundamental issues that have never been addressed. For example, such basic information as what is China's overall space budget, not their military space budget, simply how much do you spend on space? You have satellites, you have lunar programs, you have a mission to Mars coming up, you have all of these infrastructure developments. How much do you spend on space? And the People's Republic of China has never provided an official figure on this. When something as basic as your space budget is something you choose not to be transparent about, how can you expect collaboration? And they're opaque not simply to the United States. The Chinese argument, it is not for the weak to reveal to the strong. But it's not as though they are open and transparent with Thailand, which is a fellow member of the Asia-Pacific Space Cooperation Organization. And I don't think anyone would argue that Thailand is stronger than China, either in terms of budget or space. It's also very difficult to think about any kind of collaboration when we do see so many geopolitical concerns between China and the United States, obviously Taiwan being one issue, but the South China Sea being another issue. And in a non-military aspect, Chinese respect or lack of respect for intellectual property rights is guaranteed under the World Trade Organization. What we see is a lot of Chinese behavior that, again, if space is the following indicator, you need a lot of these other issues resolved if you want collaboration in space. And unfortunately, for both sides, they have too often then singled out space as some kind of, well, but if we could cooperate on this, it will suddenly become the locomotive that will improve relations. When that doesn't happen, it only poisons the well. It makes both sides now feel space collaboration doesn't deliver. The expectations on both sides, I think, were misset. But more to the point is there are really deep underlying issues that have not been addressed.
Yeah, the problem of transparency, because the way how the West interprets transparency is very different from how China interprets transparency.
There are many in China who would argue that transparency is simply a polite word for espionage. And there are others in China who would say that If I have a knife and you have a gun, how does transparency serve my interests? It is important to recognize here that from the Chinese leadership's perspective, they're not as confident as we sometimes think they are or should be. They look at space and they say, yes, we, China, are making great strides. We have achieved certain things like landing on the far side of the moon, bringing a sample back from the far side of the moon. But it is the West still that has a longer history of humans in space, more astronauts logging more hours, more satellites. From their perspective, they often still think of themselves as the weaker party. Transparency does not serve the interests of the weak.
Very interesting. Dean, it was a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you very much for participating to our Space Café Radio. I really hope this is not the last time we have the chance to discuss about this incredibly interesting topic. Thank you so much.
Thank you again for having me.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us on this Space Café Radio Prague Space Security mini-series, supported by PSSI, the Prague Security Studies Institute. PSSI is the organizer of the 7th Prague Space Security Conference, part of a prestigious high-level conference series launched in 2011. If you wish to learn more about this topic, do not miss our first Prague Space Security series, available on all our channels.